Continuing my series on World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, we now come to Japanese World War II tanks. And while you might think there can't be many of these tanks to add, there are still a few major tanks that haven't been added, as well as some cool and interesting designs that were produced in small numbers towards the end of the war. So like in previous episodes, we will start off by looking at Japanese light tanks, with Japan's main light tank in 1939 being the Type 95 Hargo, with this having a good 37mm gun and good mobility, while also being built in large numbers. However, one sticking point was its thin armour, with 12mm of armour being present for most of the tank, meaning it was vulnerable to most anti-tank guns. Now, this wasn't a problem at first because most enemy tanks were also vulnerable to it in turn, but more alarmingly, infantry support weapons like the M2 Browning 50 cal machine gun could pose a threat to it, which was not exactly ideal. Thus, in 1938, a project had been started to produce a successor, the Type 98 Keeney, which was to have the same weight but increased armour. This led to two prototypes being produced, these being the Type 98 Keeney A from the Hino Motor Company, which is already in game, and the Type 98 Keeney B from Mitsubishi, which is what we are looking at. There are some similarities between the two tanks, with them having 3 crew, a 37mm gun and a coaxial 7.7mm machine gun, these being the first Japanese tank designs to have a coaxial machine gun and not one mounted elsewhere in the turret. They should also have the same armour, though my sources say it's supposed to be 16mm, while in-game it seems to be mostly 12mm, and I'll discuss why I think that is the case in a little bit. However, there are some differences, and the main one that you will notice straight away is the suspension, with the Keeney B having a Christie suspension designed in America by Walter Christie, with this being the first Japanese tank design to utilise it, as despite Japanese tank designer Tomi Ohara viewing a Christie tank with the suspension in 1932, it had not been adopted at the time. In testing, the Type 98A suspension was found to be superior versus the Christie suspension, with the A having a top speed of 31 mph or 50 km/h, but the B should still be able to get around off-road terrain decently enough, and should have a slight advantage when on-road. Unfortunately, while many Christie designs did allow for the tracks to be removed so the tank could run on wheels only, I haven't found any indication this would be the case with the Type 98B, but if implemented this would potentially boost its speed on road even more, and making this an even more unique tank. There are also some minor changes to the hull front, with the armour at the nose of the tank being more angular compared to the rounded hull of the Type 98A, while the crew compartment is also changed, seeming to be more narrow and angular, and the fenders seem to droop down a little bit more, providing marginal protection for the tracks, at least from machine gun fire. In-game, I could see the Type 98B being added at 1.0 as an early premium or event tank, as it has very similar stats to the Type 98A, while also having the unique Christie suspension system, which might allow it better mobility when on road, which would be especially useful on city maps, while also giving us a good alternative premium tank for Tier 1, and I think it would be a very nice design to have in War Thunder. In real life, the Type 98B would not be adopted, with the Type 98A instead chosen to be put into production. So you might be wondering how many were built by 1941 and Japan's entry into the war. Well, the answer to that is 1. Basically, the Japanese army was still mostly happy with the Type 95 Hargo, with 2,300 being built from 1936 to 1943. However, with Japan's entry into the war, the whole problem of the Type 95 Hargo being too vulnerable to enemy weapons cropped up again, so the Type 98 Keeney was finally ordered into production. Now, as mentioned earlier, the Type 98 Keeney is technically already in-game, and this does look like the Type 98A prototype, but when in production there seems to have been some changes. For example, the fighting compartment is now more angular and narrow at the front, much like on the Type 98B, while the turret also appears to be different, more like that of the Type 2 Kami amphibious tank, or maybe even the same turret, as they both went into production in 1942 and it would make sense to try and share designs where possible. And I suspect this is also where the thinner armour comes from. I suspect maybe they used the thinner 12mm of armour for the prototype, while the production version actually had the full 16mm of armour, because of course the whole point of the design was to increase the protection of the tank. Now, maybe this is technically a different variant, but I think it's more likely that a redesign was carried out in the 4 years between testing and production. Now, when it comes to adding this tank, it could be added as an event tank or folded with the Type 98 that's already in-game, or maybe we could have the Type 98 that's in-game remodelled. It would have to depend on how Gaijin would like to implement this vehicle, but it would be nice to see the Type 98 Kini represented properly in-game. So the Kini was now in production, but not many tanks were made, with only 104 made from 1941 to 1943. And a large part of this was due to a reluctance by the army to introduce a new light tank into service. And in the post-war period, Tommy O'Hara, who helped design the Type 98, did express regret that this was the case. So it seems that at least he felt in hindsight that this tank should have been put into production sooner. However, another large reason for why this production was so low was that priority was now moving away from tanks and towards ships for the Navy, leading to a cut in production for tanks across the board. However, development didn't completely halt, and the Kini would be succeeded by the Type 2 Keto, which was designed in 1941 and is essentially just a variant of the Kini, but with that cylindrical turret that I mentioned earlier that looks like it's from the Type 2 Kami, and an improved Type 1 37mm gun, which in-game has a penetration of 39mm at 500 metres with its APHE shell, versus 32mm for the Type 100 37mm gun on the Type 98. In-game, I would fold this with the Type 98, as the tank is very similar to the Kini, and while the more powerful gun is welcome, I doubt it will make a substantial difference in-game, but nonetheless I would still like to see it added in-game. In real life, the Type 2 Keto would go into production in 1944, and even less of these were built than the Type 98, with just 34 being built over 2 years, and it doesn't seem to have seen any combat, which frankly was very lucky for the crew, as by this point it would have been hopelessly obsolete as a combat tank, and to be honest it probably should never have gone into production in the first place, considering its obsolescence by 1944. So the Type 98 and Type 2 were the last major Japanese light tanks to go into any form of mass production, but as mentioned, neither of them were built in any large numbers, and even by 1943 would have been hopelessly obsolete, and neither of them saw any combat, leaving the now aging Type 95 Hargo to soldier on as Japan's principal light tank, but even this was out of production after 1943. Naturally, with its successors not panning out, there were attempts to upgrade the Type 95 itself, with one of these attempts leading to the Type 3 Kiri, which is essentially just a regular Type 95, but with the 37mm gun replaced by the 57mm gun from the Type 97 Chiha medium tank. Now this upgrade is a bit of a mixed bag, as the original 37mm gun can penetrate 27mm at 500 metres versus 19mm for the 57mm gun, making this a bit of a downgrade. However, the 57mm gun can also fire the Type 3 heat shell, which can penetrate 55mm, giving a massive boost to the anti-armour capabilities of the Type 95, though the muzzle velocity maxes out at 380 metres a second, versus 575 metres a second for the 37mm gun, and potentially leading to this tank being used for close-in engagements in-game. Unfortunately, fitting the 57mm gun into the original turret left very little room for the crew, which would no doubt lead to a reduced fire rate, which is 4.3 seconds on both the Hargo and Chiha, but due to the lack of space in the turret, the Kiri would be firing far slower, balancing out the increase in firepower. Other than the main armament, the rest of the stats should remain the same, with a 7.7mm machine gun in the bow, 3 crew, maximum armour of 30mm at the mantlet and 9 to 12mm for the rest of the tank, and a top speed of 30 mph or 48 km/h, versus 25 mph or 40 km/h for the Chiha. In War Thunder, I could see this tank being added at 1.3 in the light tank line after the Type 2 Kami, as we now have a Hargo that has been given a decent boost in firepower over the original, while still retaining its faster top speed over the Chiha, allowing this tank to continue being a good flanking vehicle for Japanese players, albeit one that will still be very vulnerable to return fire from the enemy. In real life, a prototype of the Type 3 Kiri was made, but problems quickly arose from the lack of space in the turret due to the new larger gun, so it doesn't appear to have progressed beyond this point. However, this was not the end of attempts to upgun the Type 95 Hargo, as a new design would be produced that would incorporate not just the 57mm gun, but the entire turret from the Chiha, which was especially useful as there was now a surplus of these turrets, as the Type 97 was being upgraded with a new 3-man turret with the improved 47mm gun. Now, until a few years ago, this tank was referred to as the Type 4 Kinu, but it seems that further research in recent years has revealed it was possibly called the Type 3 Kiru, though I've also seen other sources saying that the name is just not known. And unlike the Kiri, the changes made to this tank are a bit more substantial, as the turret ring has had to be enlarged from 39.3 inches to 52 inches, and the turret now extends over the driver's compartment and bow machine gun position, making it a larger and theoretically easier target to hit. Like with the Kiri, it will now have all of the advantages of the 57mm gun, but due to the larger turret, it won't have the longer reload rate. While the Chiha turret's armour also maxes out at 32 to 35mm for the mantlet and 25mm for the rest of the turret, again making this a decent improvement over the Hargo's turret. Unfortunately, this does increase the total weight by about a tonne, which will presumably affect the top speed of 30 mph or 48 km/h, or at the very least the acceleration of the tank, making it a bit less mobile as a result. Lastly, despite the turret housing 2 crew on the Chiha, the crew count on the Kiru appears to remain at 3, presumably due to a lack of space within the hull itself, leaving the Kiru vulnerable to crew losses. In-game, I would folder the Kiru with the Kiri at 1.3, as these tanks ultimately have had very similar upgrades and capabilities, with the Kiru having a slight advantage in extra armour for the turret, but also reduced mobility due to the extra weight. But I would still like to see and use this rather interesting Hargo Chiha hybrid in-game. In real life, this design did far better than the Kiri, with possibly up to 100 Type 95s being converted, with most of these being kept on the Japanese home islands in anticipation of the Allied invasion, though some may have seen combat against Soviet forces in Manchuria at the end of the war. So Japanese efforts to improve their light tanks up to this point had been rather ineffective, being under-armoured, undergunned and outnumbered by existing Type 95 Hargos, which by now were proving to be rather ineffective against modern Allied tanks, while still suffering from the aforementioned vulnerability issues, though now to an even worse degree. So in 1942, a new light tank design was started from scratch, which was to be better armed and armoured, which resulted in the Type 5 Keiho design. Unfortunately, there aren't any real-life photos of this tank, so I'm having to rely on drawings and how it's implemented in World of Tanks. From the very start, the Keiho was designed to be fitted with a 47mm gun, which was initially intended to be a short 47mm gun, but ultimately it seems it was fitted with the Type 1 47mm gun from the Type 97 Chiha Kai, and this has a much better performance against enemy armour compared to the previous 37mm guns, being capable of penetrating 67mm at 500 metres with an APHE shell, versus 27mm for the Type 95's gun, so this is a good improvement over that tank. According to Tommy O'Hara, it was also fitted with one 7.7mm machine gun in the bow, though some sources mention another being fitted towards the rear of the turret, giving it a bit of defence against soft-skin vehicles on that flank. Armour was also improved, but not to a massive degree, now maxing out at 20mm, making the Keiho mostly but not entirely immune to machine guns like the M2 Browning at most combat ranges, but it is still easy prey for any dedicated anti-tank weapons, so shouldn't be relied on. All these upgrades would increase the total weight of the tank to 9 tonnes, which you would expect to slow down the tank compared to previous designs, but with a 150 horsepower Type 100 air-cooled diesel engine, the Keiho was still able to reach a top speed of 31 mph or 50 km/h, so ever so slightly faster than the Hargo, making this a good tank for capping points or getting into flanking positions across the battlefield. Lastly, the crew was to be 4, making the Keiho less vulnerable to crew losses, unlike the Hargo which only has 3 crew. In-game, I think the Type 5 Keiho could be added at Battle Rating 2.0 at Tier 2, as this tier currently doesn't have any light tanks, allowing Japanese players to use a light tank that now has decent firepower and good mobility, while still being pretty vulnerable due to its very thin armour. But assuming you are able to avoid enemies, this should make for a good flanking or hit and run recon tank. In real life, a single prototype was built, and seems to have done pretty well. However, it wouldn't be ordered into production until 1945, by which point it was far too late and so only the one prototype was ever made. So that is all of Japan's light tanks, and as you can see there are still quite a lot of them that need to be added. But for now we can move on to Japanese medium tanks, and in 1939 the main Japanese medium tank was the Type 97 Chiha, which was a pretty decent design at first, though its 57mm gun struggled against armour and its two-man turret was a disadvantage, which resulted in an upgraded variant with a 47mm gun and three-man turret. However, there was a rather unique variant of the Chiha, the Type 97 Shi-Ki, which was converted into a command tank, which involved removing the original turret and replacing it with a smaller one, fitted with radios and a new cupola. This new turret meant that the 57mm gun could no longer be carried, but in order to not leave this tank defenceless, a 37mm Type 98 was fitted in the bow machine gun position, with this gun having a penetration in game of 37mm at 500 metres with its APHE shell, while a machine gun was still fitted to the rear of the turret. Other than the armament, there would be 3 crew, one less than the Chiha, while the top speed would remain about 24 miles per hour and the armour for the hull would remain at 25mm, while presumably the turret would have a similar armour thickness to the original one. In-game I could see the Shi-Ki being added at the start of the medium tank line, or even tank destroyer line, as we have a Chiha without a turret mounted gun, but that still retains decent mobility and okay if not spectacular armour, making this play extremely differently, and more like a tank like the M1139 in the Italian tech tree, and this would be a rather unique Japanese tank to have in game. In real life, very few Shi-Kis were made, and they don't seem to have seen much if any combat, making this a rather unknown tank. So moving on, in 1940 there would be efforts to design a potential successor to the Type 97, which leads us to the Type 98 Chiho. The Chiho would be armed with the Type 1 47mm gun, which is a pretty decent anti-tank gun all things considered, while 2 7.7mm machine guns were also carried, one in the bow and one on the left side of the turret, a design feature that is very common to Japanese tanks. Unfortunately, the armour still seems to be 25mm, so more or less the same as the Type 97, and meaning protection is unlikely to be any better than that design, though mobility is also pretty decent, with a 120 horsepower diesel engine giving a top speed of 25.4 miles per hour or 41 kilometers an hour, while the total weight is now only 10.7 tons versus 15.8 for the Type 97. Unfortunately, it seems like the total crew count is only 4, the same as the regular Type 97 but one less than the Chiha-Kai, making this a bit more vulnerable to crew losses compared to that tank. In-game, I would add the Type 98 Chiho at about 2.0 to 2.3, maybe between the Ho-I and the Chiha-Kai, but it could also be folded or added as an event tank, and I could see this being a good counterpart to the Chiha-Kai, and it would be nice for this unknown tank to be shown in War Thunder. In real life, 2 prototypes would be produced by Mitsubishi and Jidosha Kogyo in 1940, while 2 more would be made by Kokura and the Sagami Arsenal in 1941, with these possibly having some different design features. These would be put through trials but didn't cause much of an impression, as the Type 1 Chihi would ultimately become the Type 97 successor, though only 170 of these would be made as priorities shifted away from tanks, while at least one of the Type 98 Chihos would survive the war to be scrapped. So in 1943 the Type 1 Chihi would go into production, but this design was only a marginal improvement, being merely an improved version of the Type 97 with a better engine and armour thickness, but the same 47mm gun that, while adequate for 1941, was starting to struggle against modern Allied tanks. There was also the issue that this new gun wasn't as effective in the anti-infantry role, so a design based on existing medium tanks would be created, this being the Type 2 Ho-I, which we have in game with its short 75mm Type 99 gun. However, while the production variant was built on the Chihi chassis, the prototype used the Chiha chassis, which resulted in an armour thickness of 25mm versus 50mm for the production variant, while presumably the less powerful 170 horsepower engine was also used, over the Chihi's 240 horsepower engine. This would result in a less mobile and armoured tank, which could fit at 1.7 between the Chiha and in-game Type 2 Ho-I, and giving players an insight into how Japanese tank development changed over time. In real life, the Type 2 Hawaii would be produced from 1944, and interestingly, while the 75mm gun was used for these tanks, it had been intended that a long 57mm gun could be fitted if needed, so that it could become a basic tank destroyer. Now, I will talk about this 57mm gun in more depth when I look at the Type 4 Cheeto, but basically this could penetrate around 60mm at 1000 metres, so a little better than the Type 1 47mm gun. It seems that this gun was tested on the Hawaii, so if its in-game performance is better than the 47mm gun, it could be added at around 2.7 to 3.0 between the Chi-He and Chi-Nu, helping to bridge the gap between these two tanks. In real life, only one Hawaii was tested with the 57mm gun, and ultimately it was decided that the short 75mm gun would be the standard gun going forward, so no more tanks were fitted with the longer gun. So as the war continued and it was seen that Japanese medium tank designs were now becoming obsolete, it was decided that completely new tank designs would be needed in the future, which would become the Type 4 Cheeto and Type 5 Chi-Ri. But as it would take time to develop these tanks, it was decided to produce a new medium tank design based on existing chassis as a stopgap, leading to the Type 3 Chi-Nu, which we already have in game. However, the initial prototype did differ slightly from the production version, as the prototype was armed with the Type 90 75mm gun, which would be modified into the Type 3 that was used on standard Chi-Nus. Unfortunately, the two guns appear to have pretty much the same stats in game, and there aren't really any other differences between the prototype and production variant, so maybe this could be added in a folder with the Chi-Nu to bolster lineups, or more likely it could be added as a premium or event tank, and it would be nice to have the prototype of the Type 3 Chi-Nu in game. In real life, the Chi-Nu would be accepted for service in 1943, but didn't begin production until September 1944, with the Type 1 in production for most of 1944, despite the Chi-Nu supposedly being a successor to that tank. But eventually the Chi-Nu would become the best Japanese tank produced in large numbers, with 144 built until the end of the war, though they would remain on the home islands and never saw any combat. However, as mentioned, it was technically just a stopgap solution until later Japanese tanks with the improved Type 5 75mm gun could be developed, but these were taking a little while to get going, so it was decided to try and fit the Type 5 into the Chi-Nu. To this end, a prototype turret from the Type 4 Cheeto that was under development was placed on top of the Chi-Nu hull, and would be presumably as armoured as the Cheeto turret in game, maxing out at 75mm for the front and 50mm for the sides and rear, which is an improvement over the 50mm front and 25mm sides and rear of the Chi-Nu. Unfortunately, the larger turret is likely to slow the Chi-Nu down, resulting in a slower top speed at worst and a slower acceleration at best, which is hardly ideal. However, as mentioned, the main point of this tank was to fit the Type 5 75mm gun, and this gun can penetrate 132mm at 500 metres with its stock APHE shell, versus 91mm for the Type 3 75mm gun of the regular Chi-Nu. So this is a massive improvement over that gun, making this far more useful against heavily armoured tanks. I could see the Chi-Nu Kai being added at 4.3 to 4.7, and honestly it would have made sense to have this as a premium tank while the Chi-Nu 2, which was built in larger numbers, would have been a regular tank, so maybe this could be folded with the Chi-Nu instead, and it would make for a rather interesting tank to have in game. In real life, testing would be carried out in March 1945, and it performed extremely well, with production ordered to commence, but with a modified production Cheeto turret, which would lead to the in-game Chi-Nu 2, but it's never made it into mass production due to material shortages being critical by this stage of the war. So as mentioned, the Type 3 was the stopgap medium tank, which brings us to the brand new medium tank designs, starting with the Type 4 Cheeto, which technically began development in 1942 as a smaller tank, but had begun development in the form that we have it in War Thunder in 1943 due to information gained from Germany on tank warfare on the Eastern Front. However, the initial weapon to be installed on this tank was not the Type 5 75mm gun, but instead the experimental 5.7cm tank gun Maru-Shin, which was based off of a previous high-velocity 57mm anti-tank gun that had been adopted for use in tanks, with the Maru-Shin designed specifically for the Cheeto. Now at this point it wasn't expected that the Cheeto would actually be equipped with the 57mm gun as standard, but as the Type 5 guns were still under development and the 57mm gun was available, this is what the initial prototype would be equipped with. This 57mm gun was better than the previous guns of the Type 89 and Type 97, in theory having a muzzle velocity of 810 meters a second, making this a much better anti-tank weapon. Unfortunately, during testing, it was found that the muzzle velocity was less than this, usually stated at around 798 meters a second, and armour penetration was found to be lacking at only 60mm at 1000 meters. A not great performance compared to contemporary British and Soviet 57mm anti-tank guns. So this gun was a bit of a disappointment, and even if it was working fully to specifications, would still be unable to deal with the more modern Allied tanks very easily. That said, it would perform better at shorter ranges, and if able to use the Type 3 heat shell from previous 57mm guns, it would have a shell able to penetrate 55mm of armour at all ranges, which would perhaps help with shooting longer ranged targets. The rest of the tank stats should be broadly the same as the regular Type 4 Cheeto, though the gun weighs less than the 75mm gun, so you might gain ever so slightly in mobility, and it seems that the prototype was actually made out of mild steel, though it's possible it would just be represented in-game with regular armour. Now adding this Cheeto variant might be a bit difficult, as the 57mm gun performs worse than even the 75mm gun of the Chinu, which is a 3.3 tank, but the Cheeto has 75mm of armour for the front, though the side and rear armour ranges from 50 to 35mm, so perhaps it could be added between the Chinu and in-game Cheeto at 3.7 to 4.0, acting a bit like the Sherman Jumbo in that it has good frontal armour, but not the best gun in the world. Indeed, at this battle rating it would be the same as the KV-1, and that has even more effective armour, so this should be a good place for the 57mm Cheeto, and here it would presumably have some decent success, and it would be nice for this initial prototype to be added in War Thunder. In real life, as mentioned earlier, the 57mm gun wasn't intended to be the main armament at the time of testing, but it was still tested in March 1944, where it was found that some of the rivets on the tank were shaken loose by the firing of the gun, and as mentioned, the 57mm gun was found to not be good enough anyway. As for the tank's fate, it's not entirely certain, with it being possible that it was scrapped, but it's also possible that it was rebuilt as the 75mm Cheeto prototype, but unfortunately this is not 100% confirmed either way. So the Cheeto would ultimately be fitted with the Type 5 75mm gun, but it supposedly might also have been tested with another weapon, the Type G, or Type G. So this is only a maybe tank for the moment, till it can be ascertained for definite, but I'd like to cover it quickly as the gun itself has a very interesting history. So the Type G was a squeeze bore weapon, where basically the end of the barrel is one caliber, in this case 75mm, and the barrel tapers in size until it reaches the end of the barrel, which is 55mm, with the projectile being squeezed as it travels down the barrel. Of course, you may recall from my German World War II tanks episode that Germany initially had high hopes for these types of weapons, with them being far more powerful than conventional guns, but ultimately they weren't adopted as the ammunition required tungsten, which was in limited supply and was also needed for machine tools. However, one of the ways that Germany was able to get tungsten, as well as rubber, tin and any other rare materials that they needed, was to import them from Japan via blockade runner. With around 220 to 240,000 tonnes of raw materials being sent to Germany via ship between 1941 and 1943, with about half of this tonnage making it to occupied France and subsequently Germany, while submarines would bring in somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 tonnes from 1944 onwards. Germany in return would send items like high quality steel, optical glass and the latest weapons, which in 1942 led to Germany sending Colonel Paul Niemöller and Major Walter Merkel to Japan, aboard two blockade runners, the former on Tannenfels and later on Regensburg before switching to the Dresden. And the main purpose of this mission was to pass along German hollow charge shells, aka heat shells, which Japan would be very interested in using for their existing guns. However, while in Japan they also showcased other German weaponry, including, quote, a recently developed 75mm barrel that narrows as it approaches the muzzle. In this case, Germany sent one model and some ammunition for demonstrative purposes, end quote, with a later Allied intelligence report identifying this as the Pak-41. Based off of this, the Japanese were able to develop their own weapon, the Type Ge, which differed very slightly from the German one, namely having 10 ports on the muzzle brake versus 8 for the Pak-41. Supposedly, this weapon was a massive improvement over previous Japanese guns, though there's very little information on this gun, with most of the information coming from a Reddit post from My Waffenträger, who posted a drawing of the gun and information that it supposedly had a muzzle velocity of 1260 meters a second and was supposedly able to penetrate 140mm at 915 meters and 210 at 100 meters, though it's not said what angle this was at. Now, these stats might seem a little different to other figures you might have heard for the Pak-41, with a reduced penetration but higher muzzle velocity. But the reason for this, I believe, is that the shell being used here is likely the German Panzergranate 41W, which uses a steel core for the shell, giving reduced armour penetration but greater muzzle velocity. However, this shell was only intended for training purposes, meaning that if the HK version with a tungsten core is used instead, we have a lower muzzle velocity of around 1125 meters a second, but a greater armour penetration of 209mm at 500 meters, or 177mm at 1 kilometer, though there were also other German shells that could have been used as well. That said, it is also possible that some other factors could be behind any discrepancies, such as different types or amount of propellant being used, the composition of the armour being fired at, or even the use of a Japanese-designed shell. But unfortunately, I don't have access to the Japanese documents or way of translating them sufficiently enough to confirm any of this. But getting back to the Type Ge, this penetration, if true, is massively better than anything the Japanese have already, as at 100 meters it beats out the Type 3 75mm gun by 110mm, the Type 5 by 98mm, and even the Type 5 NATO's APHE shell by 69mm, though its German-based Type 4 APCR shell is beaten by just 35mm, though still making this a massively better weapon for penetrating enemy armour. However, the Type Ge would be firing APCR rounds, which do less damage post-penetration, though I think they are still pretty useful rounds and can still often one-shot or cripple enemies, even if not as well as an APHE shell, so I still think this would be a pretty lethal weapon to be around. As for its place in War Thunder, it could perhaps be added as an event tank somewhere between 4.3 to 5.0, depending on how well the APCR round works, and I think this would be a rather cool tank to have, making it into a very long distance shooter if required, and allowing it to take down tougher tanks that maybe its original gun can't, albeit at the cost of post-penetration damage, and it would be nice for this tank to be added to War Thunder if the relevant documentation is found to be genuine. In real life, the Japanese also seem to have had fairly high hopes for this weapon initially, as they theoretically didn't have the same issues with tungsten that Germany had. I mean, they were even exporting tungsten to Germany, so they were hardly hoarding it. Despite this, Japan decided against adopting it, maybe because of limitations of the weapon, tungsten becoming harder to ship back to Japan due to the catastrophic losses to the Japanese merchant marine from the American blockade, or maybe they simply saw more of a future in more conventional shells, or the new hollow charge shells like those brought to Japan by Colonel Niemöller and Major Merkel. So that's about it for the Type 4 Cheeto, which would have been one of Japan's most advanced tanks, but as it turns out only 2 complete tanks were made along with 6 chassis, with the complete tanks being dumped in Lake Hamana at the end of the war, though the Americans managed to recover one of these, presumably just to scrap it later, and efforts have been made to locate the other one over the years, though not successfully as of the time of this video. There would also be the 37-ton Type 5 Chi-Ri, but only one of these was made and it is already in game, which brings us to the end of the Japanese medium tanks and onto the Japanese heavy tanks. Now unfortunately, things get a bit difficult here as Japan didn't really develop heavy tanks like the rest of the world, at least outside of the interwar period, with the Chi-Ri probably being the nearest thing they had to one. However, there is one design that sort of fits the bill, the OI, which is actually more of a super heavy tank supposedly weighing well over 100 tons. There is also virtually no information on this tank, which does make covering it rather difficult, and as of July 2024 it was confirmed not to be eligible for adding to War Thunder due to a lack of information. But I'm going to cover it briefly anyway in case the situation changes in the future. Now, unlike most other tanks, there are some arguments against whether it even existed in the first place, due to there being literally no photos of the tank, which again some might find odd, but remember this is a fairly common occurrence with Japanese vehicles, as you've probably seen with some of the previous tanks we've looked at. And then of course there are other vehicles, for example, here is the Japanese carrier Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier of the war by weight, having been converted from the 3rd Yamato hull, being worked on as an aircraft carrier from July 1942, then launched on the 26th of October 1944 and sank shortly after on the 29th of November. Despite this being a rather unique and large aircraft carrier, there are literally only 3 photos in existence. This fairly close-up photo by a civilian on a tugboat, an aerial shot by a Japanese aircraft, and another aerial shot by an American B-29. So if that civilian just hadn't taken a photo that day, just didn't bring his camera in, we would only have 2 very far-off shots of this massive aircraft carrier. And if those aircraft hadn't taken those photos, we'd have literally no photos. So I can easily believe that the OI also wouldn't have many or any photographs in existence. There does also appear to be documentation in existence of this tank, now held by the Fine Moulds Company of all people, this being a company that makes scale models, and a piece of track is present at the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Forces camp Takigahara, as well as some testimony from engineers post-war, though some of this testimony was contradictory. So based on all this, it is understandable why Gaijin doesn't want to attempt adding this, but it does seem that it did exist, at least in some fashion. As for the stats, as far as I know them, it was to be armed with a 150mm Type 96 howitzer in a central turret, though I've also heard mention of a 105mm Type 92 gun. And the howitzer could fire HE and AP shells, while 2 other turrets at the front of the tank were to be armed each with a 47mm Type 1 gun, while a 4th turret was to be armed with 2 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns, making this a very well armed tank, with the 47mm guns providing good penetrating power, while the 150mm howitzer can lob effective HE shells at enemies, though the machine gun turret at the back, while theoretically being useful as an anti-air turret, is probably not going to be used very much if at all. Armour was also pretty impressive, with the frontal armour being a maximum of 150mm with some sloping and angling used, while the sides are 70mm but are extremely flat, making this armour rather less effective. Meanwhile, the top speed for this potentially 150-ton tank was theoretically 18.6 miles per hour or 30 kilometers an hour from 2 600 horsepower engines, though I seriously doubt it would ever get to that speed unless going downhill, and the crew was supposed to number 11. Which makes sense considering how many turrets there are. Now, as mentioned, these are the stats as I understand them, and we have confirmation that the OI isn't slated to be added to War Thunder due to a lack of information, so don't expect it to be added anytime soon, but if added it could make for a good event tank along the lines of the Dreams Come True event we had for the TOG2, and it would be nice to see how this tank would operate in game. As for its real life history, the OI started development in the aftermath of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, where Japanese tanks fought against more modern Soviet ones, resulting in the development of newer Japanese tanks and guns, including an order to develop, quote, a gigantic tank that can be used as a mobile pillbox on the Great Plains of Manchuria, end quote, while also needing to be twice the size of existing heavy tanks, this being the 26-ton Type 95, but it ended up being a minimum of 100 tons. Construction of the tank would begin in March 1941, finished around January 1943, and testing began in August, but without the turrets or additional bolt-on armour. But due to the ground being soft, the tank would sink into the mud and the suspension was damaged as a result. It was recovered and tested further, but this caused even more damage, and at this point it was clear that there wasn't really much of a use for the tank, especially now that most of the fighting was taking place on remote Pacific islands. And so, at this point or some point in the future, the tank would be scrapped, leaving us with just the one track link. So, having looked at regular Japanese tanks, it is now time to look at flamethrower tanks. And unfortunately, there aren't many designs here that have a flamethrower and the usual main armament. But we do have the Kaho flamethrower tank, which is based on the Chiha chassis, with 2 Type 100 flamethrowers on each side of the hull, with these having a range of 20 to 30 metres. Presumably the 57mm gun would be retained, but isn't present in the pictures, but would allow for the Kaho to still act as a regular tank, though a bit more vulnerable due to the addition of a fuel tank for the flamethrowers, while the rest of the stats are presumably the same as on the Chiha. Overall, this could work as an event tank at 1.3, and it would be nice for Japan to get at least one flamethrower tank for its tech tree. So we're almost at the end of the regular tanks, which brings us to amphibious tanks, and unfortunately most of them are already in game, and while in theory we could get the type for Katsu, this was intended more as an amphibious APC type vehicle, thus was only armed with two 13mm machine guns, making this at best a 1.0 to 1.3 anti-air vehicle. That said, tests were carried out where they were fitted with two torpedoes, so maybe this variant could be included in some sort of event, but beyond that I can't see this working in game. I should also mention the Type 5 Toku, which was supposed to be built on the Chi-Ri chassis and had a 47mm gun fitted to the hull, while the turret was a modified one taken from the Type 97 Chiha Kai and was fitted with a 25mm gun. However, sources are a bit contradictory on whether this was actually built, and I don't think this actually ever had a prototype finished even if it did begin construction, so it's very unlikely we'd see this tank added to the game outside of an event vehicle. So that just about brings us to the end of Japanese tanks, so we will take a look at some potential Japanese tank destroyers, assault guns and anti-air vehicles that could be added, starting with the Type 5 Horu, a tank destroyer design based on the Type 95 Hargo chassis. Now unfortunately there are no photographs of this vehicle, but basically the design was started in 1945 in order to produce a light tank destroyer design for use in defending Japan in the event of an invasion, while also using Hargo chassis that would have been now obsolete, giving these tanks a new lease of life while saving on scarce resources. Unfortunately, documentation on this tank destroyer as a whole is sparse, but we know it was to be armed with a 47mm Type 1 gun, the same one as used on the Type 1 Chihi, and is pretty good at dealing with low tier tanks, while a semi-enclosed fighting compartment is provided for the crew. Beyond this, we know very little about the Horu, with the rest of its stats likely being the same as the Hargo it is based on, so probably about 9 to 12mm of armour, though it's possible extra armour was added to the design, or was different for the fighting compartment. While it's likely it had a top speed of around 25 miles per hour at 40 kilometers an hour and a crew of 3, though it's also possible it had a crew of 2 or 4. In-game, I would add the Horu on the tank destroyer line somewhere in tier 1, maybe at 1.7 with the Ho-Ro and Rogo experimental being folded. And here it would be a good tank destroyer with a powerful gun and okay speed, as well as being smaller and easier to conceal than the Hargo, though vulnerable to enemy fire, but it would still be nice to experience this little known tank destroyer in War Thunder. In real life it seems that a prototype was completed and tested, but whatever the results of these tests, it didn't go into production, either because it was rejected or maybe there was just not enough time or resources to produce it before Japan's surrender, and it's likely the prototype was destroyed during the war or scrapped shortly afterwards. So the Horu is an example of a very late war tank destroyer design, but an earlier tank destroyer design was the Type 1 Honi 1, which was armed with the Type 90 75mm gun and is already in War Thunder. However, the prototype of this tank destroyer did have some rather interesting features that were removed from the production version, namely a rangefinder, which would make this one of only 2 Rank 2 vehicles to have one, the other being the Soviet Yak-10 29K. This could probably be added at 2.0 to 2.3, depending on how much of an effect this rangefinder has, with this being either a regular or event vehicle, and either way it would be an interesting tank destroyer variant to have in-game. Also, while we're on the subject of the Honi 1, in-game it only has 3 crew, but quite a few sources say that it was supposed to have 5 like the Honi 3, so that could also probably be rectified, helping to improve the survivability of this tank destroyer. There was also an artillery version of the Honi 2, which replaces the 75mm gun with a 105mm Type 91 howitzer, which was able to fire HE, ABHE, heat, shrapnel and incendiary shells at a muzzle velocity of 546 meters a second. The heat shell is supposed to have a penetration of 120mm compared to a maximum of 103mm for the 75mm Type 90's ABHE shell, making this a much more useful round, while its APHE shell will penetrate about 71mm at just under 500m, so about 20mm less than the 75mm gun, while the HE shell I suspect will penetrate about 30mm or so. In War Thunder, I think the Honi 2 could be added at 2.3, probably folded with the other Honis, or on its own just after them, with this giving us an effective tank destroyer type vehicle that can more easily tank down enemy tanks due to its effective heat shell, while also having a better HE and okay APHE shell, and it would be good to have the last Honi variant in game. Another Japanese tank destroyer that is already in game is the Type 5 NATO, but supposedly this was also intended to be fitted with the Type Gay squeeze-bore gun that we looked at earlier, but there is some disagreement on whether this actually happened. But if it could be added, this would make for a good 4.0 tank destroyer, having much better penetration than the NATO's existing 75mm gun, while lacking in post-penetration damage, but would give us some extra variety with regards to this vehicle. Moving on, and unfortunately there aren't really many other pure tank destroyer designs, except for the Hori, which is technically in-game, as a prototype and production version. Now, the premium prototype variant is based off of a wooden mock-up, and generally seems to be implemented in a way that it was sort of intended to be, while the production version in the tech tree is just straight up made up, having much thicker armour and a more powerful engine than was designed, or possibly even existed. But all of this is somewhat irrelevant, as the two prototypes that were being built in real life were never actually finished, and to make things even worse, they were not based on the wooden mock-up, with the Hori 1 being built on the Chiri hull, so includes the frontally mounted 37mm gun, while the Hori 2 was intended to have a centrally mounted casemate and rear-mounted engine more akin to the German Jagdtiger. I'm not sure how far along these prototypes actually got, but seeing as the Hori in-game is pretty much a fantasy design, I would be more than happy to have these replace it in the tank destroyer line, probably folded with each other, and it would be nice to see how they would have actually looked and how they would perform in-game. Before we leave the Japanese tank destroyers, I would like to just make a small mention of the SO2 gun carrier, which is basically an armoured chassis designed to carry small guns, usually 37mm guns, but possibly even 47mm guns. However, I'm not entirely sure if these guns were able to actually be fired from the SO2, or how much traverse would be available if they could. But if it was added, this would make for a decent low-tier tank destroyer, with no armour for the firing platform except whatever gun shield is present, 12mm of armour for the tank itself, presumably 4 to 5 crew, and a top speed of 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour. If it could be added, it could go at the beginning of the tank destroyer line at 1.0 for the 37mm variants, and if a 47mm variant was added, that could go at 2.0 between the Rogo and Honi 1, and this would make for a rather unusual tank destroyer design to have in game. Moving on from the Japanese tank destroyers, we can now look at assault guns, starting with the Type 4 Ho-2, a vehicle based on the Type 95 Hargo, kind of similar to the Type 5 Horu, but unlike that vehicle, the Ho-2 is armed with a 120mm Type 38 howitzer, which was a rather old weapon from 1905, but was used as a last-ditch weapon towards the end of the war. As an older weapon, it has a rather anemic muzzle velocity of just 276 meters a second, making longer-ranged targeting a difficult proposition, and while it technically has an APHE shell, I can't imagine it would do much damage outside of point-blank range. The other shells it could fire were shrapnel and HE shells, and I suspect the latter would penetrate around 30mm, but it could also fire a heat shell, which I suspect based off the smaller 105mm Type 91, means it will penetrate around 130 to 150mm, maybe a little bit more, making this a rather deadly shell in-game. Other than the gun, the other major change is the removal of the turret and superstructure and replacing them with a basic fighting compartment, with limited protection from the front and partially the sides, with the roof and rear completely open to enemy fire, making it a very vulnerable vehicle to flanking and air attacks. Other than these changes, the armour should be a maximum of around 9 to 12mm thick, while the exact speed is not known, though I suspect it will have a maximum speed of 22 to 25 miles per hour or 35 to 40 kilometers an hour, so again not a massively mobile vehicle. Meanwhile for the crew, I've seen 2 listed, a driver and commander, but I suspect a crew of 3 to 4 would possibly be more likely, as I suspect the combat efficiency of just one person manning and loading the gun along with all the other duties wouldn't be very high, though I could be wrong here. As for the Ho-To's place in War Thunder, I would place it between the Chi-Ha LG and Type 5 NATO, as while its HE and especially APHE shell might struggle against enemy armour, its heat shell should do fairly well, though it would be limited to close quarter engagements unless piloted by a skilled player due to its low muzzle velocity. While its small size will serve it well in ambush situations, and it would be nice to have another Japanese artillery vehicle in-game. In real life, only the one prototype was made, and only one photo exists of it, and it was likely scrapped during or after the war. Supposedly, there was also an attempt to mount the massive 20cm length 12 short naval gun onto a Chi-Ha chassis, similar to the Chi-Ha LG, and this could fire HE, incendiary shrapnel, and possibly AP shells, with the HE shell having an explosive mass of 13.6 kilograms, which is somewhere between the South African G6's 11.14 kilograms and the later Japanese Type 99's 14.8 kilograms, giving it a penetration of around 60 to 65mm, which is a decent performance, but I don't have any information on the shrapnel shell or AP shell if one was available. For such a big weapon, it had a fire rate of 4.5 to 5 rounds a minute, which isn't too bad, but the muzzle velocity is only 305 meters a second, and no doubt the gun will be slow to traverse, and I suspect the crew would be mostly unprotected, with the tank itself being slowed by the gun's weight, and the crew would probably number 4 to 6 depending on how many loaders were needed. Unfortunately, there's not much other information on this vehicle available, and it's likely the prototype wasn't even finished. And if added in-game, I'm not sure where it could be added, but maybe at rank 3 to differentiate it from the Chi-Ha short gun, and I suspect this would be used as a bit of a meme vehicle, being suited to short-range engagements where you can one-shot virtually all tanks, and it would be cool to see this vehicle in action. So lastly, we can now move on to Japanese anti-air vehicles, and to be honest, most of these have already been added, leaving us very little choices on new anti-air vehicles. There is the Type 98 Kohi half-track with a 20mm autocannon mounted at the back, making this almost equivalent to the Type 94 AA vehicle already in-game, with the Kohi having a slower top speed of 30 miles per hour or 48 kilometers an hour, versus 37 miles per hour or 60 kilometers an hour, while the armament is the same and armour is non-existent, while the crew should be around 3 to 4. Honestly, this wouldn't add much to the game, but could be added at 1.3 in a folder with the Type 94, giving us some extra options in maps with lots of off-road terrain, and adding a bit of variety while showing off a Japanese half-track. Then there is the Ki-To, which is based on the Type 97T Ki chassis, and basically involved removing the turret and fitting a 20mm autocannon to the roof, without any protected fighting compartment or even gun shield. So based on a decently fast chassis with a top speed of 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, and presumably a crew of 3 to 4, 2 in the hull and 1 or 2 manning the gun. Unfortunately, this vehicle would be very similar to the in-game Tarsei, except that vehicle does have a bit of armour to protect the gun crew and has a top speed of 31 miles per hour, making the Ki-To an all-round worse vehicle. Perhaps it could be folded with the Type 94 SPAA at 1.3, or it could be the starting anti-air vehicle at 1.0, but honestly this would have to be an extremely low priority for adding. Other than that, there's not many other anti-air vehicles. There is also a picture of a Type 2 Kami with a anti-air gun mounted at the rear of the tank, but I'm unsure if this was actually mounted while the tank was operational because it appears to be above the engine deck, or whether it was just added to a non-functional tank to provide a little bit of extra firepower around a defensible position. Then lastly, for anti-air vehicles, there is the Shisei from 1925 that I covered briefly in my Japanese interwar tanks episode, and this is basically a 75mm Type 88 anti-air gun mounted on a truck. And to be honest, with the Type 88 having an in-game penetration of 75mm at 500 meters, it's probably going to be better suited to shooting ground targets, as most enemy aircraft will be far too quick for it to easily target. While it seems it was intended to be fired whilst stationary with these outrigger legs deployed, so it may just not be a very good vehicle to add in general, or a very low priority one at the very least. So that is it for this episode looking at Japanese tanks from World War II, and I think we've managed to cover most of them, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on these tanks and any other ones you would like me to cover. So I'm hopefully going to cover Italian tanks next, which shouldn't be a long video like most of the others in this series, so I hope you will join me for that. Anyway, I've been Terreno, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.